What's the most disturbing thing you have personally seen? Story 1. By the time I was a teenager, my dad was severely physically disabled. One day, my dad accidentally crapped himself and started rage crying about it. His helplessness, despair, anger, and self-loathing in that moment was the most horrible thing I've ever seen, and I've had nearly 40 years of opportunities since then for something to top it. Story 2. I left my little hotel in Nairobi to go to street market for some fruit. Was thinking about some crap from earlier and looking at the ground. I rounded a corner and saw this odd, pinkish gray chunk of brain. I looked up and 8 to 10 meters in front of me a truck was stopped and a boy's body was lying on the ground. The fact that only a couple people were standing around showed that the event had been incredibly recent. Like seconds before. People were amassing by the second. My Swahili is very bad. But the boy had tripped right in front of the truck's back tires and it had rolled over his skull and the pressure had strewn its content all over the street. Story 3. Years ago in my early 20s I had a downstairs neighbor that was 35. Dead-end restaurant job and a severe alcoholic. I was just sitting on the porch smoking and heard the shotgun go off. Knew immediately it was Patrick and that I probably needed to go down and call the police. That's a sight and smell that never leaves you. I think about him a lot now that I'm a 35-year-old recovering alcoholic. Back then it seemed so extreme to my young and not yet jaded mind. Now I kinda get it. Story 4. My dad, in the final stages of dementia, wandering around the dance floor at my sister's wedding, getting angry with people because no one would tell him what time the helicopter back to Malta was at. He had regressed back to when he was stationed there with the army and was adamant he would be getting picked up at 1800. I took him home shortly after this and he got increasingly angry in the car until, sitting at traffic lights, his entire demeanor changed and he turned to me and asked, "Ian, what's wrong with me?" That was the last time he ever called me by my name. Story 5. When I was young and broke I didn't have enough money to get home after work and my truck ran out of gas on a busy freeway. It was near a high overpass, and managed to coast my truck down the off-ramp and park near a gas station at the bottom. While I was on the phone calling a friend for help, I heard the screeching of tires. I turned to look just as two cars going about 60 miles per hour collided head-on. There was a thunderous boom from the overpass where the cars hit, and one car flew high into the air, trailing debris, turned over mid-air and dropped straight down maybe 50 feet onto the road below the overpass. The car landed on its hood and the top was completely crushed. I was still at the scene when the fire truck arrived. Firemen ran over to the car with the jaws of life, halted when they saw the car up close, then slowly walked back to their fire truck to get a tarp and threw the tarp over the car. They didn't even try to pry it open. Story 6. Witnessed my 34-year-old brother-in-law die of cirrhosis last summer. He drank a liter of Fireball every single day for 8 months. By the end, he was emaciated, he was a deep dark yellow all over, and he had a belly like he was 9 months pregnant. The day he died, he was gasping and gurgling, with blood in his mouth and on his lips, and his eyes were rolled back. My sister and I stood by his bedside. By that time he had been transferred to palliative care/hospice. No tubes or wires, no monitors, nothing. We stood there holding his hand, and then it all just stopped. We looked at each other like, did he just? No more gasping or gurgling. Just silence. I'm glad he's at peace now. But the way he went was horrific. And so very, very young. I wouldn't wish any of it on anyone. Story 7. Got a call to a singed car accident at 4 in the morning. This was the first call I had been on for the community volunteer fire department. I get on scene, find a car overturned in the ditch, with the driver dead in the front seat. I notice a car seat in the back, but didn't see a child or any other sign that one was present. Fast forward 5 minutes, I'm closing off the road, other people from the department are arriving on scene and I hear someone come out of the bushes next to the road right next to me, a child, no older than 5 or 6, she asked if we could be quiet, because her mother was sleeping. I was absolutely gutted. I resigned not long after. Story 8. Used to work at a municipal animal shelter. We had a puppy come in that had been struck by a car. He was fine except for a non-functional front limb that would need amputation the next day. The surgery was scheduled, but apparently it wasn't fast enough. I came in the morning after it had been brought in to find that the puppy had gotten the e-collar off overnight and was eating its own leg. Apparently all the feeling was gone in the limb and it looked like a tasty treat. Needless to say, the surgery got moved up and the puppy got a more heavy-duty e-collar to ensure it didn't harm itself further. Story 9. My father when he was in a narc rage at me. I'll never forget his eyes going pitch black as he was in my face screaming at me because he had been just playing when he had what I thought was a loaded gun pressed to my forehead, and pulled the trigger. Why he was lashing out at me was I got so terrified that I started crying and begging for mercy. I was 5 when that game started. And every time was no less terrifying. Story 10. I used to work maintenance at an old folks' home. One day I come in and there's an ambulance outside. Turns out a resident, this really sweet old man with a Yorkie, had cut himself in the middle of the night and was on blood thinners. My manager and I were told to go in and clean up what tissues were strewn about. No, this isn't something we were qualified to do. You're supposed to call in a specialized team to take care of this stuff, but I was a dumb college kid and didn't know this till afterward. There was so much blood, the most screw up this you could follow a path around the apartment and see how he tried to patch himself up. That poor old man, his poor family. Story 11. My child being born. When I gave birth to my son, he came out totally lifeless. Not moving, not breathing, eyes totally peacefully closed. They whisked him away to start the chest rubs and suctioning. He took over a minute to cry and become normal, longest minute of my entire life, and I could do absolutely nothing but stare. Totally didn't affect him at all, but I still think about it sometimes as I watch him run around. Story 12. I was part of a law enforcement team serving a warrant on a person who had filmed child abuse. We had all seen the abuse after the oldest child in the household had turned 18 and fled taking videotape with them. We were tasked with his arrest and it was high risk as he was an avid hunter/firearm collector. We observed him walk out his back door onto his property carrying a double-barreled shotgun, shorter barrels. He sat down on a lawn chair and proceeded to basically remove his head, firing both shells at once. The abuse was disturbing, and his head coming apart while I watched it through a rifle scope is burnt into my memory. Story 13. My wife's a mortician. During the height of COVID, all of the funeral homes, hospitals, and the morgue in our country were filled to capacity. The small funeral home my wife managed at the time had to rent 2 refrigerated trailers to hold the excess overflow of bodies coming in. One day my wife calls me from work and asks if I can come down and help open up the trailer as she and the 90-something pound staff lady she had on hand couldn't quite get it on their own. I work from home and used to work at UPS, so I knew how to get those crap open, so it was no big deal for me. Anyway, I get there, open up the trailer, and God. I had seen bodies before, and intellectually, I knew what was going to be in the trailer, but it was pretty jarring to see that many bodies in one spot. It really put into perspective how bad COVID had gotten. Story 14. I used to work at a veterinary hospital and I had to hold puppies while the doctor cut their tails off. In my opinion, if an owner wants their tails docked, they should have to hold them. It's super easy. Physically. Edit, this was over a decade ago in the US. I don't work in veterinary medicine anymore, but I know that the practice stopped docking tails a couple years after I left. The doctor would first separate the correct 2 vertebrae with forceps, then cut that spot with scissors, put 1 stitch in and put them in the dun basket where they would try to suckle on anything hoping it was their mother, but it was just a bunch of other traumatized puppies. Other vivid memories involved fishing/pulling maggots out of various orifices, but actually participating in intentional trauma was the worst. Story 15. I spent 8 years as an EMT before a back injury forced my retirement from the industry. I've seen spinal injuries. I've seen sexual assault victims as young as 7 years old. I had to pull a high school classmate's body out of a house after the fire department put the flames out. I've seen another classmate get killed by his brother in a drunken argument. I've seen homicides. The one that sticks with me the most was a guy running around his front yard, completely naked, on bath salts. At one point, he grabbed the catheter that was strapped to his leg and yanked it out of his MRP while the little balloon was still inflated. Y'all ever seen a hot dog after it's been in the microwave too long? That's what this guy's cock looked like. Story 16. I saw once what looked like a racially motivated attack on a black kid about 12 years old by some Hispanic kids from the block. The scene was horrific. Something out of a movie. Kid was about to get killed, so I intervened with my brothers. We were about 15, 13, and 11 years old. Once we got involved, we realized things were completely different from what we had thought. The Hispanic kids carry out this toddler who was about 4 years old. Kid was so severely bruised his legs looked blackish red and purple, also his back was completely slashed up. Apparently this black kid was let in by his friend's mom to wait for his friend to arrive from school in her home. He got a hold of this child and severely abused him within 30 minutes. The Hispanic kids were carrying out street justice, and had this black kid looking like he had got hit by a car. His head and face was so swollen from getting hit. Me and my brothers watched as they tortured this kid for what he did to that toddler. It was so bad that I never saw him again, and he lived down the street. We felt bad at first, but after what we saw we realized that kid was an animal. Story 17. I was at my best friend's mom's house for a pool party 2 summers ago. In the middle of casual conversations with his family, I hear some men yelling, "Get him out of there." They pulled a heavy-set man out, as he had sunk to the bottom of the pool, and nobody noticed until some kids playing with a drone spotted him. They didn't really administer proper CPR. They were trying to get him to puke up the water by gagging him with their fingers, so he was there letting out gasps for air every 30 seconds or so until he just stopped. He was taken to the hospital, but my friend said he died. He and I spent the rest of that night just contemplating our mortalities, especially because my friend is also a big fella and he just got married, so he had always kept this thought of dying young and leaving behind loved ones in a manner like this. I wish I could say this has influenced me to live my life better, but it's taken baby steps for that, like a baby who has some kind of disorder that prevents them from aging properly, but baby steps nonetheless. Story 18. When I was like 4 years old, I was in a terrorist attack. I was at the mall with my mom and suddenly the power went out. We then heard an explosion from outside, followed by one of them yelling, "If you're a Muslim, we'll let you go." My mom was talking to her Muslim co-worker at that time and begged him to pretend that they were married so we could all escape safely. He completely ignored her and ran out of the building. My mom carried me and ran out of the building while dodging bullets and falling tiles from explosions. I was bawling my eyes out at this point and was even having difficulty breathing due to the dust. We made it out to the parking lot and my mom put me down for a split second but was still holding on to my arms. That's when I got shot 2 times in the leg. We hid behind a car and 2 bullets hit my leg again since it was an open space. I was in unbearable pain and was basically screaming. My mom tried calming me down and tied her scarf around my leg to stop the bleeding. I looked at the car next to us and saw this man who was hiding behind it. He peeked his head out to see if he could make a run for it, but he sadly got shot in the eye. The sight and the fact that I was losing a lot of blood made me pass out. I woke up in the hospital with stitches on my leg. Luckily no bullets hit my bone and I stayed in the hospital for a few weeks. Now that I'm 14, I'm happy to be alive, but I can't walk all that good and my hearing is kinda crap. The image still haunts me to this day, and sometimes I feel like I can feel his presence at that mall. Even though the mall now has upgraded security and it's completely rebuilt, I still get super nervous going there and to malls in general. Story 19. Back in high school, I spent Friday night at a friend's house. We got bored and went for a walk before sleep. After walking a few blocks, we saw some flashing lights. When we turned a corner in the street, we came upon a scene of multiple police cars, fire trucks, and an ambulance. Emergency personnel were busily going about their duties, rushing to and fro. There had been a bad car accident. 2 cars smashed into each other head-on. While my friend and we were standing there, I noticed a girl I had gone to a dance with sitting alone by herself in the front yard of her home. She looked very traumatized, so I went over to say hi, a little too cheerfully I think under the circumstances, and immediately felt kinda stupid. But she barely even noticed me and did not say a word. Witnessing a wreck right in front of your house is pretty traumatizing, I thought, so I backed away quietly and let her be. The look on her face was ghostly. She had that 1,000-yard stare people talk about when they describe Vietnam vets who have seen some crap. It was not until days later I learned she did actually not live at that house. She had been drunk driving when she hit another car head-on, killing a father of 4. Story 20. In 1993 I was 13 and staying with my mom's 50-something-year-old friend and his 2 older kids while she was in the hospital. He was a recovering alcoholic who recently relapsed. One night he got drunk and his 18-year-old son was pissed at him, so he decided to film him being drunk so he could show him the next morning in the hopes of embarrassing him back to sobriety. The next morning my mom calls the house wanting to talk to him. I go into his room and found him dead. It was surreal. His body was positioned in a weird way and his mouth was open. The first second I saw him my mind instantly said he's dead, but that scared the crap out of me, so I had to check. He was super clammy and cold to the touch. His eyes were rolled back, and his arm was weirdly positioned behind his back. I put my ear to his chest and it was silent. I got an image of a shut-down factory in my head. Now that I knew he was dead, I felt extreme sadness, because I now had to tell his kids. The son that recorded him the night before didn't believe me and got irritated, thinking I was playing a prank. He went to check himself and started bawling. I felt so bad. I had to go tell his older sister too, who did the same thing. The son ended up blanking out the tape he recorded by pointing the camera to the wall and hitting record. He didn't want that to be the last footage of his father. Story 21. I'm a medical student and I feel like cadaver lab is a truly horrible experience. You have to actively dissociate in order to not think about the fact that you're peeling off someone's skin, pulling their organs out, cutting their heart open, etc. The worst was around Halloween when we were learning about the face. They used a bone saw to slice the cadaver's skulls in half down to the throat and splayed their heads open like a book so we could see the internal structures, nose, sinuses. For the mental picture, they kind of looked like the clickers from The Last of Us. It was horrific. There's so many other disturbing things, especially as it got later in the year and we had dissected almost everything out. I saw an eye that imploded BC. We had to remove the eyelids and it just kind of dried up. One of the bodies turned green. Like Gumby green. I had nightmares. Once anatomy was over, I never set foot in that lab again. Story 22. A few come to mind, but the most disturbing would be my girlfriend, at the time, and I finding her mom dead in her bedroom. Several mental health issues and many case attempts, some of which I already had to help through. Someone mentioned agony of trying to OD on Tylenol. That crap did not look fun. Always had me on edge thinking it was inevitable, but when? One Sunday morning, her got into her husband's gun safe and shot herself while we were down in the basement doing whatever and getting ready to start our day. We were going to get fresh bagels and headed up to ask her mom what kind she would like. Seeing her mom and hearing my then girlfriend's scream when we found her mom is burned into my memory. She also thought her mom was pulling through hearing sounds coming for her. It kept going as her mom's sister walked into the house, coming to look for us, and me blocking her from going in so she would not have to see her sister that way. Her husband was out golfing and we had to tell him to come home. He was so sure that safe was secured. Story 23. Car crash, Lexus is 130 miles per hour into a tree. I was coming home late from an event, maybe 12 or 1 a.m., on a dangerous back road. I slowed down because I saw plastic in the road, and then saw an engine separate from a car on fire in the median. The kid that hit the tree was 22, and was both inside and outside his Lexus 300 at the same time. He was wrapped up in the seat, firewall, and a pillar. Surprisingly, not much blood. I put the fire out with my hands from his burning catalytic converter, and put my hand on his neck to check if he was alive. I might have felt a single, very light pulse/pump/jolt and then nothing. But it could have just been me. I checked 2 or 3 times and was pretty shaky. CPR was impossible anyways because he was wrapped up across the chest with steel and glass. Checked the rest of the car and tried to bust the rear window to look for passengers, but he was alone. Went back, said a prayer or two for him and sat with him, then EMS showed up. They made me stay for a bit, but they confirmed he was dead on impact. Pretty sure the kid was a street racer, found his Instagram afterwards. Same city, some friends knew him. Kid was my age. Tripped over a bloody crock on the way back to the truck, still had some pins in it. Don't do stupid crap. Story 24. My mother was diagnosed with a brain tumor and was given about 6 months to live. She was adamant that she was not going to die with her head in a toilet because of chemotherapy. My sister and I made her as comfortable as possible at home as she didn't want to die in a hospital. Got her a live-in home care professional, spent every waking minute not at work with her, all her family and friends came to visit and waited for the end. The worst days were when she admitted she was scared of dying and the day she was having a seizure and we called for an ambulance. I sat with her slightly shaking. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring at me as I held her hand and tried to soothe her, waiting for the ambulance. That's when I knew she was gone. She ended up dying in the hospital about a week later, so we could be sure she didn't suffer. She never regained consciousness. Story 25. 2 years ago, watching my father have the heart attack that eventually killed him. He was holding eye contact with me when he actually stopped breathing. Seeing his eyes glaze over, looking right through me as he slumped back on the couch will probably haunt me forever. Leading on from that, paramedics were only able to get him breathing again after about 20 minutes, enough to cause brain death, a fact we didn't learn until a few days later when doctors ran the necessary tests. We made the decision to take him off the ventilator after a week, to give friends and family a chance to say goodbye. Watching this man, who had always been the strongest person I knew, reduced to a twitching vegetable with a tube down his throat, and then having to see that every day for the last week of his life, was utterly horrific.